Before I go ahead, I am going to talk about a few health case studies and patient preferences, but I did want to first talk about the methods of preference elicitation. And one of the main methods we use are called discrete choice experiments. And some of you in the room might be familiar with that term, sometimes called choice modeling, sometimes called choice experiments, sometimes called conjoint, but they all mean the same thing. And it's a method that you can use. So I'm going to jump outside of health for a moment, just to give you an illustration of the methods, and then come back and actually present a couple of case studies, including the one that Steph mentioned too, that we're doing for Janssen. So first off, I wanted to touch on one particular study that we did. So with how choice modeling works is we present whoever the market, the person that we're speaking to, a situation similar to the choices that they'd actually make. In this case, this is work we did for the Department of Communications valuing broadband speed. You're all familiar with the NBN? You want to know how much people value download speed? This is how you do it. Here we have brands. Here we have things like gigabyte limits, speeds, upload, download, plans, mobile bundles, all the different types of things that people make decisions on. And this was the method that was part of the cost-benefit analysis that the Department of Communications used. So at the Institute, we work in health quite a lot, but we also work outside of health. So in all these leading decisions that people make in terms of education, environment, housing, voting, infrastructure evaluation, we at the Institute will work across all those decisions, and health is also a key priority for us. But how we work out what people value is you essentially give people scenarios like this. They make a choice, and then we give them another scenario. Things may have changed. So the brands at the top may have changed, the download speeds have changed, the cost of the plans have changed, and we look at how you choose. And how you choose determines what you value. And that's why it's called choice modeling. So at no point do you ask people what they value. It's all derived through models. And that's generally how we do it in real life, right? No one actually sits down on a bit of paper and rates and ranks what they value in a plan. They go to an online comparison website like this, they value up what they want, and they make a choice. And that's what we try and mimic when we do choice modeling. Another example, student choice. This is for another government department, but it's evaluating international student choice of universities. We are in one of the leading universities at the moment, but you can see here the students are evaluating the location, the state, the fees, the ranking, the accommodation, the rent, the cost of living, the transport, all the things that an international student would take into account when making a choice of which university they would like to study in Australia. So this is another example of what choice modeling is and how it can be used. This is just one scenario. As I said, you would do multiple scenarios, and the parts of the levels that we call these parts here would change. And then they don't change randomly. They actually change based on what the researcher decides, based on an experimental design. And that way, when you make your choices, we get the most amount of information by how you choose. So it's not random assignment, it's actually based on a complex experimental design. This is another example that we're doing at the moment. This is for the Art Gallery in New South Wales. You can see here, current gallery described by characteristics of the art that houses, the type of exhibitions, the facilities, the learning, and all of the different characteristics. And then there's the Sydney Modern project. And if you're aware of the Art Gallery of New South Wales, you know that they have this large upgrade called Sydney Modern, and we are valuing what New South Wales citizens place on that infrastructure. So this is one way you could do it, where you present changes, hypothetical changes. The new gallery houses this, the new gallery has a ferry terminal, the new gallery does this, that, and that, and we look at whether you would actually choose going to the new gallery over what the existing gallery is, and we can try and get a value. The same methods they use in non-market evaluation, where you actually don't have a market, there's no trading going on, but you can actually do that. For example, the environment, and one of the ones that's going to be done soon is the Opera House. You can actually put a value on the Opera House. It's not whether you attend something at the Opera House. The Opera House as an infrastructure has a value, whether it be to people in Sydney, but also as to people in Australia, because obviously it's a huge particular feature for us. So that's just giving you a bit of a flavour of what the stuff we do outside of health, so you can understand the methods, and when I'll move into the case studies. Briefly, the origins, I'll just touch on that a little bit. So one of the earliest models that was probably done was with Thurston in 1931. He's a psychologist, and he was actually getting people to trade off combinations of hats and coats, and shoes actually, but very simplistic choice model back in the 1930s. And it's gone a long way since then, a long and established literature, all the way leading up to the year 2000 with, that's Daniel McFadden. He won the Nobel Prize in the year 2000 for his derivation of the models that we use in choice modeling. So a long and established history in terms of where it's come from and what it's going, and the work that's been done since McFadden won the Nobel Prize. Another case I just wanted to touch on briefly was a high-profile case is Samsung versus Apple, Apple versus Samsung. So patent infringements in terms of the user experience. So a couple of the recent case studies, particularly you can see here some information taken from this particular article in terms of billions of dollars that were awarded in patent infringements. The court cases actually used choice modeling as a valid method of preferences. So to look at how much they value one patent infringement over another, whether it be a swipe, whether it be extending your finger, whether you can do this, Apple has a different screen, all of those things can be valued based on looking at certain attributes of the phones and working out how much that particular attribute has as a portion of the overall phone's utility or value. So Hauser at MIT did that study, and that's an accepted method. And some of our directors actually go to court as expert witnesses and actually support choice models that we do here in Australia, whether it be government work or industry work. So I guess I wanted to show you that's one of the only preference methods that actually are accepted in the court. And so you get a bit of a background of what we're doing here. These are how we typically present the output from these models. So you could sort of see the scenarios that I showed you before. These are the dashboards. So whatever we want to present that comes out of the models, we'll show you these dashboards. And they have all the key information that you need. So if you want to make a change, for example, here we're looking at elections. These are voting policies. You can see, you probably can't read them, but turning back the votes is one of them. Same-sex marriage is another. How much do Australian citizens value the particular policies? You have here, this is the NBN one, and this is actually looking at satisfaction, customer satisfaction. So lots of different ways you can present it, but essentially all the information that you need and anything that you can perform like what-if scenarios. So for example, what if this price went up? What if the safety of this drug changed? What if it could provide additional years of survival? All of those things can be done using dashboards or to provide what-if scenarios. Because all the models that we do those sophisticated models, but they all sit in the back end. And we don't necessarily have to look at those because not everyone understands what those are. But this dashboard is easy to understand. Anyone can use it, and you can make changes and see how the models work in real time. All right, so now onto the health case studies, which is probably all we're waiting to see. And the first one, as Steph mentioned, the work we're doing with CLL with Janssen. And we have a little bit of information about the condition of CLL there in terms of the number of patients each year. And it is, although not being so rare, but it is still a small group of patients that we're dealing with. In regards to the approach, what we do is we always start with exploratory work. So when we're talking about quantitative models, we always start with qualitative work. So we're always going to talk to patients and find out what's the most important to them, have a discussion, try and make sure that we're covering off everything in that space that's important, what's happening in their life, different stages that Steph mentioned. There's going to be different preferences for patients at different stages. So that's always the first part of where we start any study. And then moving down towards a couple of points. So one is the clinical, which is sort of, if you've seen a choice model before, it's like that treatment A, treatment B type approach, and with the key aspects of those treatments, and I'll show you examples of that in a moment. But the other side is the personal, and we have certain valuation techniques which are similar to what I've just shown you to value the personal. So what's most important to this person's life? What stage of life are they at? Do they have family? Do they have financial considerations? All of the different aspects that would link in with their clinical preferences. So you want to get both. You don't just want to know here because you understand that there's difference in patient preferences, but why are there differences? Where are they coming from, their experiences, goals, values, all of those different things from psychology that would lead us to believe that there will be differences. And then going down to treatment alignment. So essentially, once you do these models, you can align any treatment. So I can put in those values into that dashboard and work out how well it aligns with what patients want. So as the slide of the talk goes, what do patients want? This will tell you what they want and how well anything that you present to them, will, as long as it's been incorporated in the model, will weigh that up. Sampling with the patients. So with this particular case study, we used various means. So working with patient advocacy groups, healthcare team, and through advertising. We got some patients through the advocacy groups as well and through the healthcare team, but through advertising was quite successful here. So that was going through radio ads through 2GB, other various parts other various media where we thought we might be able to access the type of patients that might have CLL. And they would then contact a recruitment agency that we were working with to express interest in participating. Briefly, I'll just touch on some of the qualitative work. So this is some of the slides that came out of that qual work. So we did have 12 in-depth interviews. We did have a mixture of face-to-face and phone, and they were conducted by I'm not an experienced qual interviewer, but we do work with experienced qual people to do that. And you can see some of the things that are popping up in terms of patient association. So frustration, serious threat, fatigue, uncertainty, unpredictability. These are sort of the things that the patients were telling us coming out from the qual work. We can divide that more closely into a couple of pillars, and this is how it was presented in the qual study, and focusing on a couple of those core aspects. So that personal side of the disease and how it affects patients' lives, some of the core things we want to gather. So you can see we have this emotional impact, and obviously you won't be able to read all of that, but I just wanted to cover off the general gist. So the emotional impact of the condition, the physical impact. Moving on to the social, and you can see these are some of the things that the patients were reporting are important in these particular aspects, and then the financial. So there are other things that were expressed in the qual, but this is just 4 little summary pillars of some of the things that were coming out and things we would want to take into account as we sort of work up and build these models and look at the differences in what patients value and what they want. This is an actual scenario in terms of the introduction. So you can see these are the attributes that we had in this particular study, ranging from the various things, but we were tested on what the patients valued, what the clinical trial information was being presented with, so we can try and capture what a treatment would look like in this context. I will present you an actual scenario, but this is the information. We have survival, remission, or progression-free survival. We have a list of side effects or adverse events. We have administration, whether it was oral or IV, and then we have out-of-pocket costs. The severity of the side effects are presented using these circles here in terms of grading, which is similar to the trials, but in a wording that the patients would understand. And then we have risk. It's important to have risk, and how patients decode risk is important because obviously not all the side effects are working at the same risk. So you need to provide that information as well. It's not certain that you will experience all the side effects that you would get for the treatments. This is the actual scenario itself. So as I said, we present people with choices and look at how they choose, and that determines what they value. This is the clinical side of the study, so this is treatment A, treatment B type approach. So you have all of the different attributes that are presented here. You have survival in terms of average survival in years. You have remission period. You have all the side effects, diarrhea, nausea, fatigue, muscle and bone pain, rash, fever, presented by the severity and the risk. You have administration, and you have out-of-pocket costs. Out-of-pocket cost is not treatment cost. It's other things around the treatment, travel, doctor's fees, all of those other things that are around, not the treatment cost, because we're assuming that it's subsidized. So it's not looking at that, but it's trying to see if there are any other factors that are weighing up whether people trade on those things. So whether they do consider cost when they're making these decisions, it is important to them. This is the dashboard that I built for this particular study. So you can see it does a few different things, which I'll take you through in a moment. But there's a handful of different aspects. So here you can actually see there's a treatment index. So you can put in any of those attribute levels there that I was talking about, and you can see how well it aligns with values. Basically rescale between 0 and 100. So the lowest profile would be 0. The one that has the most utility or most value is 100. I've rescaled everything. So you can see I've made a change here. I've moved survival up and I've moved remission period up. I've jumped to 80% essentially. I can actually manipulate, and I've changed it to oral. I can manipulate all these characteristics and see how well they align with value. So I'm going to show you in a moment some of this benefit-risk trade-off, but essentially this model will allow you to do benefit-risk modeling for patients on what they value. This is another type of analysis that you can get from the models, essentially treatment A, treatment B, and you can see here that I've set everything at equal, so it's 50-50. Everything's equal 50-50 between treatment A and treatment B in terms of what patients would prefer. You could use this to set up the current treatment. So what's the status? What do patients currently use in the standard of care? What's the new treatment that you're possibly looking at, might be coming out? Or there might be things that don't even exist yet. So these models are hypothetical preference, well, hypothetical, they're real preferences, but they're hypothetical scenarios. So we can actually model things that don't exist yet. So you can try and see, okay, what if there wasn't an oral product in this market and now there is? How would patients respond to that? How would they value that? You can make changes once again, and you can see here I've manipulated a couple of these key characteristics here in terms of survival and remission, and you can see that patients prefer treatment A over treatment B. You could then start manipulating treatment B and see how that would affect it. But you can set these scenarios yourselves based on what exists in the market or what you would like to see in being traded off. This is the overall hierarchy of relative importance. The caveat on this that it's relative importance because it's importance that's determined by what levels we had in the model. So for example, I had cost variable in there. If I was to put, and I think we went up to 3,000, if I was to put cost up to 50,000, That's a huge, between 3 and 50,000, it's a huge level range. Of course, that would drive up the impact here. But if I keep it in a level of realism, you can see that relative importance, given what I tested, is determined. So here, so average survival, out-of-pocket cost remission, administration, and then varying through the side effects. So this has just been rescaled for you out of 100, so you can get a bit of an eyeball as to what was important to patients. But you could get this from just playing with the model itself in the dashboard, but I just did this as a matter of course so you could see what is having an impact and what isn't. Another one that I want to present was quality of life. So you may have seen a quality of life survey that was sent out through this particular event. So some of you may have done it, which is a good exercise to try and see what was a choice model like. What would it be like if I was a patient completing this? So this is the actual task that you might be familiar with. So it's based on the EQ5D, 5 dimensions: mobility, self-care, usual activities, pain, discomfort, anxiety, and depression, person A, person B, who has a better quality of life based on your perceptions. And then you do multiple scenarios, and I can then work out how you value the 5 dimensions. And that's essentially how a lot of these quality of life measures are weighted or factored into terms of the weights. What you can do there is similar in terms of the results, is you can go person A, person B, if they had these characteristics, who would have a better quality of life, based in making these changes on what-if scenarios through the dashboard. You can see I've made a change here. Moderate problems for mobility, moderate problems for self-care, and the person A's quality of life in terms of the mix between A and B has gone down. So overall, people are saying you can move any of these attributes and try and see how they would factor in. This is the overall for the average. So everyone who did the study, when I do the aggregate level, this is the weighting. So you can see here, it matches up with some of the EQ5D studies that have been done. So anxiety and depression, pain, discomfort are the most important factors, and then it sort of filters down depending on some of the level of magnitude. But what you can do is you can get individual level scores. And so everyone who did the model, if you put your email address in there, I would know that uniquely identifies you. I can give you an actual score. So your unique ID here, this person here, number 1, follows a very similar pattern to the aggregate. But if I then look to another person, very different. Mobility is much more important, and pain and discomfort is much more important relative to the other 3 factors. And now look at this person. It's completely switched. Now it's more about mobility, not so much about anxiety and depression. So as I said, if you did put your email address in and you did do the study, I'm happy to give you your personal results for this particular study. And I've spoken to a number of people anecdotally, and they've told me that this does match up with what their preferences were. If you are struggling with the task, finding it difficult to work out where you value as you go through, what you would see here is probably that you value everything. You probably have equal weight because the model can't determine the signal from the noise in terms of what you were given, because you weren't 100% confident in your own preferences. But if you are, the model will determine what you value. So it depends on how you were going and how consistent you were in your preferences. The last study I wanted to talk about is the FDA guidelines and a study that they've done which had a significant impact in terms of patient preference, in terms of the decision-making through patient preference studies. It was actually a weight loss product called Maestro. And they presented a similar type approach, device A, device B. I won't go through the particular characteristics of what they presented, but it's the same sort of scenario choice model that you would have seen me present earlier. They were looking at trade-offs amongst effectiveness, safety, all other attributes associated with devices in this particular area. And they used DCEs to quantify this benefit-risk type approach for the patients. And then what came out of it was a dashboard or decision tool, which would basically determine the minimum weight loss acceptable by a patient to receive a device and the maximum mortality risk tolerable in exchange for a given weight loss. So these trade-offs you can actually get from these models. They then used that to present to the FDA, and the actual trial itself showed that the product didn't meet clinical endpoints, but it was approved anyway based mainly on this patient preference study, because they knew that there were certain segments of the population in this particular market who would accept that level of risk and benefit and would want to use it. So they actually approved it on that. And that's where the FDA is moving in this space. And that's something that is really interesting for me to see. And I wanted to, I guess some of you may be familiar, but I wanted to present that. You can see the paper here. If you're interested in looking at the actual paper, it's referenced here. There was a lot of researchers working on this study in conjunction with the FDA. So you'll see a lot of the FDA members are actually authors on this particular paper. But they put it down in terms of they have a couple of preference preference studies, so one in devices and one in drugs, but they're putting out preference guidelines. And in those guidelines, they have this type of quadrant, benefits and risk. So they're saying patient studies would be relevant to any of these particular quadrants, some more so than others. So for high benefit, high risk, patient preferences information would be very important to see which segments of people would be willing to accept that risk for that benefit. Even for a low benefit, high risk. There are some patients who may take that on board. To do these types of studies, you can actually find out what those segments are, who those patients are, and you could actually provide information in labeling, which is where they're going in the FDA, to say, okay, we understand it's a patient decision. We have preference studies to work out those values. They should be taken into account in regulatory approval. These are the guidelines. This is the devices one, so the MDIC one. It's already published. This is the draft guidelines on the drugs. I haven't seen the final revised version yet, but they both take you through the information. Case studies like the one I just showed you with Maestro, and other case studies, and also preference elicitation methods in general. What's accepted, what's not accepted, what do they do, what don't they do, how you should present the information to the regulators. So it's all covered in these guidelines, and we're looking to do similar things in Australia in terms of giving case studies, showing you what's acceptable, providing the literature so you can see, and so it has some level of rigor, and that could be used to make decisions in the Australian context. But these are some of the 4 key things that they're showing in those guidelines. So they're talking about voluntary submissions, so they're not forcing everyone to make submissions. They're obviously focusing on the quality of the study, so what's important for a quality study, recommendations for collecting information, and then include how you should include information from these particular studies into the decision making, and it might go into labeling, and that's where they're looking at in the FDA. This is another life cycle diagram. You may have seen other ones presented, but this is the one that they have in their guidelines. And it's trying to show you where you could have patient information and where it would be important. Obviously, patient preferences are important across the board, but you can see here they're dividing it into the life cycle of treatment, but just discovery and ideas and R&D, moving all the way to preclinical, clinical, regulatory decision making, and then post. All along the line, they're looking at patient preferences and how they're important, and different methods that you could use to elicit those preferences, and then provide those to wherever the stakeholders are. So it's important across the spectrum. It's just a matter of what part do you want to do. Are you talking to patients, and then what methods you might use along that chain. So where to from here? What we're trying to do with this type of work, and I presented a few case studies. But what we are doing is our institute, in conjunction with the Sanson Institute, as part of University of South Australia, which is headed by Ian Olver, who a number of you in the room may know. We're looking to actually host a forum in 2016, so early next year, which is actually looking at incorporating patient preferences into the HTA decision-making criteria in Australia. So obviously patients are our core group. I4C is the Institute for Choice. Other academics obviously are involved, so that's the academic portion of it. Leveraging off with government, healthcare team, and industry. So bringing these key stakeholders together to have this discussion. The preference methods are there. They're used outside of health quite regularly. They're used in health as well, but we want to make them having more impact in this decision-making process, and that's what we're trying to do, is get those stakeholders together to have that discussion. What are the benefits of doing that? For patients themselves, you can actually, as I showed you before, you can actually get individual preferences. So that would be really interesting for a patient to go through. What do I value? I have an idea about what I value, but I don't necessarily know the hierarchy or the magnitude of what's most important to me. Making these choices will give me that. How do I compare to other patients? So, for example, the CLL study, how do my preferences compare to other patients with CLL in Australia that we've spoken to? That's very important to give feedback to the patients. So it's not just about us getting information for research, it's giving information back to patients that they can then take on board. That links in obviously with the government. That's part of the forum, so we want the government to be involved, look at how they're using patient information now, and what they can then do with the information once we put it into more of a rigorous format like the choice modelling structure that we're doing now. In terms of the healthcare team, you could actually use that. It'd be really interesting for the patients to do this type of study, whether it be in the doctor's office or not, and then present that with their doctor to have a discussion. So what do I value from treatment? Clinicians will have an opinion about what's important, what they value. They obviously have a say in some of the stuff with the decision making. Patients don't have a great deal of a say at this point in time. It'd be really nice for the patient to go, hey, let's have a discussion about this with my doctor, now that you understand better about what I value in terms of treatment. And then obviously industry, you can look at how well treatments that we have now align with values, what other things do patients want, what do we have in the pipeline, how with things that don't exist yet, how would patients respond to that, what do they value. So you can do a lot of research and development and alignment with treatments and actually then quantify the value that these treatments would have with that particular patient group that you're talking to. So I think that's all I really had to talk to you about at the moment. Thank you.